I just wanted to first off thank the Secretary for that great scene-setting introduction, and also a big welcome to everyone and congratulations to everyone who's put on this conference. I know it's a huge challenge to put on a conference, so I know a lot of work goes into it, and thank you to everyone who's done that and for inviting me to be part of it. So what I'm going to do is set a little bit of the scene around high-cost therapies, and then we're going to have a second speaker, and he's going to follow on a little bit. So I'm going to do a little bit of scene setting, a little bit of detail, but further detail will be provided by the second speaker from NICE. So you've heard my disclaimer here is I am a chair of the Medical Services Advisory Committee, which is one of two committees that assesses health technologies in Australia. The other one is PBAC, where I was also a member for a long period of time, and the views I express are my own, not those of representing the Commonwealth. So Australia's actually had a very long history of HTA assessment, and we've used HTA to inform decision-making really since the Second World War, was when this sort of technology sort of first came into existence, but it was only in 1992 that we started to incorporate economic assessment, and that has become a fundamental foundation of how we've assessed pharmaceuticals and their values, but that's now flowed on to many other technologies as we increasingly face a world that is not just about assessing the value of a drug any longer, but is so much more complex, and medical care has moved on from just being about drugs to being about a vast array of other technologies. So I've written here this sort of cycle diagram of how HTA is currently used in Australia, and I think primarily we look at HTA as a health technology assessment on entry into the marketplace. And in Australia, we're increasingly starting to think more and more about health technology management rather than just health technology assessment at the point of entry into a particular marketplace, whether it's Australia or elsewhere. And this whole idea of this is an investment life cycle, and although we've had lots of attempts over the years to try and look at disinvestment or look at changing the way that technologies are used once they enter the marketplace, we've largely been very ineffective. And so looking now at much more a system that looks not only at the assessment on entry, but also the whole management life cycle of that technology from beginning to end is something that we have to shift our thinking on right from the moment that a particular technology applies for reimbursement. So that's why I've called this HTA is really part of an investment cycle that starts when you start taking taxpayers' money and paying for something, and stops when you stop paying for it. And at each of these steps, we need to be very clear about the technologies and the assessment processes we're going to use as we continue to evaluate that technology. So high-cost technologies are coming from many sectors now, and this slide just shows you where I've seen the changes in new technologies. We all know pharma, and pharma continues to grow at a rate. Cumulative annual growth rate is looking at about 11% at the moment, so it's continuing to grow. But we also see increasing interest in health technologies and in entries into the health markets from biotech. That's now growing at a rate of 11%, so equivalent to our pharma counterparts. And medtech is also growing, currently now at 5%. If I had shown this diagram, I think, a few years ago, you would have seen a big blob of pharma and a tiny little biotech and a tiny little medtech. But now those three industries are growing very strong and very powerfully, and where we're seeing a lot of activity is really, and particularly high cost, is coming from biotech and medtech, not as much from pharma, although they continue to be big players in this space. This slide here shows you the clinical trial activity, which gives you a sense of where people are working in these different areas across the sector. And historically, you can see we were running at about 8% growth rate, and then that started to take off around 2019, 18. And we're forecast to hit a very large number of clinical trials now. But what you will notice immediately from the slides here is that change in proportion of phase 1, phase 2 and phase 3 trials. So you see now that there's 12% at phase 1, 10% phase 2 and only 5% at phase 3. And that's altered over this period as we're seeing technologies coming to health reimbursement committees much, much earlier on the basis of phase 1 evidence, single-arm studies, handful of patients in a study, and then they've moved on to the next application, really without following through with our classical phase 1 or phase 3 randomised controlled studies. So there's a huge push on health technology assessment committees such as PBAC and MSAC is to really accept the reimbursement arguments based on smaller and smaller patient numbers, less and less information, less and less evidence, and so that uncertainty ratio starts to go up. We start thinking this is a very uncertain space, but we're not going to see that change. We're going to get more and more of these early phase data, and patients are going to increasingly insist that we look at that early phase data very favourably and work out ways that that can be funded while evidence is generated. And that while evidence is generated is a very hard thing to police. It's a very hard thing to set boundaries on that. And we know that we've been largely ineffective when we've tried to say, well, this coverage with evidence development and we'll readjust price and we'll readjust patient population. Once the door is open, we find certainly in Australia it's very hard to close it or even just sneakily shut the door by a little tiny bit. So that's the sort of milieu in which we're all working, including obviously in Singapore. So many new technologies are now relevant for healthcare, and I just tried to list a few of these challenges we're facing. Expansion in the number of complex modalities of care. So we have advanced drug deliveries coming in with drugs and devices moved together. We've got point-of-care diagnostics, 3D printing with a bit of a drug attached to it. So there's all sorts of complex mixtures of healthcare all being packaged up and saying the patient needs all of this in order to be able to be treated effectively. There's a lot more targeted therapy. Where's this targeted therapy coming from? Well, the sequencing of the Human Genome Project did generate a lot of this, but it's more than that. It's not just the genomics projects, it's the functional genomics and the omics, and a whole raft of deeper understandings of biological processes are actually generating more and more bespoke treatments which are personalised for a handful of people. This idea of real-world data, which is a terminology I really don't like, but more and more people are starting to use data collected in clinical practice, perhaps not in the way that is really designed to be used, and they're using that data to post hoc justify the continued reimbursement of medical services, medical devices and drugs. I've talked about the precision medicine, which is really basically a function of this idea that you can molecularly characterise different diseases instead of having to use our traditional methods in the way of cancer in morphology, and that's also fundamentally changing which patients should get access to care. And then the final one, and probably the most important, is that consumers have access to a huge amount of information now, and they're reading things almost faster than their doctor is reading it. As soon as they get that information, they want access to that at a cost that they can afford. So there's a big pressure from consumers, which is a good thing. They're just deciding what they want for their care. But at the same time, it's about how you mediate their desires against the desires of others. So in 2021, a Commonwealth Standing Committee was convened. This came to a head as a result of the consumer push to understand more about what was available to them. They felt that the technologies were being reimbursed far too slowly. They didn't have access fast enough. And these were some of the things that came out of that inquiry. Precision medicine, we need to work out a way to fund this better for a smaller number of people. Patient involvement needs to be increased so that patients are involved in which things get funded and which things don't get funded. The complaint, although the technology is actually becoming more and more complex, that was reflected in the way we're assessing these technologies, and patients were arguing, well, although the technology is getting more complicated, we'd like it to all be much simpler. So that's the challenge that we were faced. And then, as you say, value-based pricing structures, which we heard from the Secretary, are really needed. So cell and gene therapy, that's just one example of a high-cost technology. And this is based on the idea that the whole genome, now sequenced, is actually druggable. We can find a drug for any disease. We can cut out genes that are bad. We can replace genes that aren't there. We can find a drug that's going to target a gene. This whole concept that 20,000 genes in all of our genome, we can fix whatever's broken inside the human body, and there's a drug for everything. So this is a real revolution in our thinking. Why is it so attractive? Well, gene therapy is proposed as a one-time treatment. You just have to have it once, and then you're cured of the disease, and therefore you won't need to worry about going on looking at ongoing adherence issues to medicine. There's no need to take your medicines every day. Have a gene therapy and you're restored to normal health. That will then restore people back to full productivity. And it also has the potential, this is the arguments that are being made, that over a whole lifetime of someone's existence, if we fix the problem now, well, then they're cured for a lifetime and you don't need ongoing interventions. So it's a compelling argument, and one that is being pushed very hard, and a high price tag is attached to this. This sector is growing at an exponential rate. So I just checked the number of trials just in preparation for this talk. There are 1,200 clinical trials currently in progress, 100 in phase 3 that are awaiting regulatory decisions. The leading areas are in oncology, CNS disease and cardiovascular disease, so the big areas, big burdens of disease, lots of people. Investment companies are now up to 26.3 billion in Australian dollars in 2020. A lot of different cell therapies are now at the point of undergoing regulatory approval. And in Australia alone, we have more than 60 companies developing cell and gene therapy products. And that means there's a lot of people currently in clinical trials. The clinical trials are a way to familiarise patients with the importance of therapies. So I think we're going to go and see more and more of these therapies are coming down the pipeline to all our countries, and that's something that we're possibly not well prepared for. There are huge challenges when you try and assess cell and gene therapy. Often they're targeting very small number of people in the populations, but they have a severe unmet need. So it's very hard to say, well, they don't really need the treatment. Of course they need the treatment. But there are a lot of rare diseases. At the moment, about 5,000 inherited rare diseases. So if we need cell and gene therapy for each of those people, that's fantastic. But if you're being charged a lot of money for every one, that can add up to a lot of cost for the finance and for the budgets of the countries. It can potentially change the course of the disease, we find, but when we look at these therapies and we look at them from an HTA point of view, there's still lacking a lot of long-term outcome data. It's still short-term data, it's still small numbers of patients, it's still single-arm studies. In order to achieve the best outcomes for cell and gene therapy, you may need to diagnose the population at a point before they become symptomatic. And I'm going to get onto that in a moment, because if we want to get the best out of replacing genes in people, we don't want them to already have lost nerve function or lose vision or lose their capabilities that then needs to be restored. So this preemptive treatment is something that I think is definitely on the pipeline. This has a complex array of therapies around this. You don't necessarily need the service, the therapy, you need the device and service, and a very complex manufacturing paradigm are often involved. So it's really this health technology management. So patient engagement is part of the submission. A patient-centred approach to HTA is required. Patients definitely are supporting this view across the world. We do need systematic and rigorous ways of incorporating consumer input. It can't just be sort of in an unmeasured way. And understanding what society really wants as a whole, including the advocacy groups who want their particular intervention supported. This is a slide that was prepared by Rare Voices in Australia, and they continually emphasise this. We want equity, not equality, and that's a good illustration of what they're talking about when they mean that, when they advocate for these things. We look at HTA assessment by either committee. MSAC has done most of the assessment of HTA on cell and gene therapy, but that's largely because of various financing arrangements. But they can go to either committee. And I don't expect you to read this, but I know you've got the slides, so I've just thought I'd write it out. But this is the story of the funding of Zolgensma, which is for SMA. It went to the PBAC because it was there was another couple of drugs, nusinersen is the first one, that we needed to compare that against. But it shows you the story of this drug and how it came to be funded in Australia, or this cell therapy. And Luxturna was another therapy that was funded for children with inherited retinal disease, or as a result of a recessive gene, which essentially led to blindness and restoration of improved vision as a consequence. These therapies were massively expensive for every person, and these are just a couple of the stories of therapies that we have approved in Australia. So cost effectiveness, I tried to put this in because I think there's a balance between cost effectiveness, we're all familiar with ICERs, and budget impact. And Luxturna was an example of a therapy that was very high in terms, it was very high cost effectiveness. ICER was very, very high, but the budget impact was pretty low because there's only a handful of people in the country with the disease, so that looked pretty okay. If we compare this with a drug which is used for type 2 diabetes, but also was proposed to be used for obesity, $1 billion a year, very high ICER, very high total financial impact, budget impact. So what should be included in an ICER and a budget impact? And this is where I'll draw to a close. This has come about through thinking about SMA and other rare diseases. If we were to implement population-based screening of 300,000 couples, which we've been asked to consider, it's already under consideration, even for 3 conditions, and then expand it to as many recessive conditions as there was a therapy for, then the budget impact just to find those people would be about $200 and something million a year for us by year 6. So if we started screening the population to find these rare conditions for which a therapy would then be available at $500,000 a therapy. So that's the sort of numbers that we're thinking. CAR-T, similarly, if we include all the costs of supply chain and changes in hospital arrangements in order to generate and supply this T-cell therapy, it changes the cost effectiveness. And so Luxturna might move over here. If it costs us so much money every year to find those people who might be eligible for Luxturna, it might start to move its quadrant into something that has high total budget cost to the country and a high ICER. And it might be sitting up here with a diabetes drug. There's a lot of these therapies coming into the marketplace. I've just done a bit of a plot of the ones that are coming to Australia over the next few years, just to show that this is not something that's going to slow down. We have them for keratinocytes, allogeneic cells for treatment of burns, a lot of treatments for cancer, and a lot more treatments on the near horizon. Treatments for haemophilia, sickle cell disease, beta thalassemia, a lot of replacement therapies here, a lot of rare diseases and a few common ones like prostate cancer, although that trial has now failed, but a lot of treatments that are just around the corner. So, in conclusion, requirements for HTA for high-cost technologies is ensuring equitable access to technologies guided by the engagement with your population. We need to provide a very proactive response to what is a very dynamic healthcare sector and a changing industry all the time. We need to build, I think, not only an Australian capacity, but also an international capability in assessing health technology assessment. There's not enough people in every country to really go through all of these things and get to grips with them. And prioritise our resources, and economic sustainability has to be at the forefront of every decision maker's mind as they think about how they're going to balance the healthcare costs across the sector. So with that, I'll conclude, and thank you very much for your attention.